Today we're going to learn how to configure HTTP access to analysis services using IIS 7, which is the version of IIS that ships with Windows Server 2008 R2. In this walkthrough we'll use SQL Server 2012, but the procedure is virtually the same with older versions of analysis services. This process is fairly well documented on MSDN, and I'll put the link to this MSDN document in the notes below the lesson. The first thing the document goes through is some of the scenarios where we might want to use HTTP access to analysis services. Most of the time we use this kind of configuration when we have ad hoc user clients using tools like Excel that need to query analysis services from the internet or from extranet sites where they don't have complete access to using OLEDB connections to analysis services. And the basic architecture that we're going to configure looks like this. Our users will come into IIS using HTTP or preferably HTTPS to connect to IIS, and these users might be on the internet and they'll only need to connect with TCP over a single port. So they won't need to connect to Active Directory or use ports directly to analysis services and so on. Once they connect to IIS, the data pump is a DLL that's running within that process that then proxies for them connections out to analysis services using XMLA to do queries and bring things back. First, let's plan our configuration, and in my case I have an Analysis Services 2012 tabular instance running on a SQL 2012 database server. What I'd like to do is connect an Excel user who's on the internet to this tabular instance, so that user can just pull up Excel, click on the Connect to External Data Source Analysis Services button, and then connect directly to this, of course using their username and password and going through an encrypted tunnel using SSL. So to do this I'm going to add IIS to the database server and use the msmdpump.dll to allow IIS to make connections to analysis services on behalf of this user. As a side note, if I wanted to have the web server separate from analysis services, I could certainly put it on another server. I would have to configure Kerberos delegation to do that. I'm not going to do that in this configuration, but if you're interested in that, put a comment at the bottom of this video, and if enough people want to see it, then I'll go ahead and make another pass at this with Kerberos delegation. But whether there's delegation or not, the way the user will connect is by going through the internet, and in this case I'll have them connect to a Forefront TMG firewall, and that firewall will actually reverse proxy for that user and send their traffic to the web server and then to analysis services. This would work basically the same way with a different kind of firewall, or even if the database server was connected directly to the internet. To get started with the configuration, I'm going to create a new DNS for my analysis services tabular instance, and I'm going to call that SSAS Tabular. Down below in the FQDN that will get filled in with the rest of the names. So the fully qualified domain name for this analysis services instance is going to be ssastabular.bluegranite.com. And I'll paste in the IP address that will point to and add that into my DNS configuration. So now that's there. Next we're going to create folders and create websites in order to address the server. The instructions on MSDN will have you make a configuration that ends up with a URL that looks something like this, where it's the web server name /olep/msmdpump.dll. I really don't like having my users have to type all that in. I think that's confusing for them. So I think there's a better way to do this, and I'm going to show you the way I prefer, which is to use a host header name directly to that analysis services instance. I think it's a lot simpler, and I don't have to instruct users to do things like typing in DLL names, which they will interpret as being a security problem probably anyway, but that's just my preference. By all means, if this approach in MSDN works for you, then go ahead and use it. With DNS set up, the next thing I'm going to do is create a folder for my website that I'll use to expose the analysis services tabular instance to my users. So I'll create a folder, and throughout I'm going to use the name SSAS Tabular. It could be anything, but this will keep it straight in my mind. Into this folder I will copy a few files. The files I need to copy are the MSMD pump itself and some supporting files. I can find those within my SQL Server installation. So if I follow down my analysis services tabular instance and just keep going down bin, then ISAPI, and I'll find these two files in one folder. So I'll just take all those and copy them. Don't move them, but copy them into the website folder that you created. And next I'm going to change this initialization file to point it at the analysis services instance that this site will actually reference. So I'll run Notepad as administrator. Go find my tabular folder, open up the ini file. The only change I need to make is to give it the server name and instance that I'm going to connect to. There we go. We'll save that. And the other settings at defaults are fine for now. Exit that, clear the screen a little bit. Now that we've created that folder, we need to move on and create the website that will point to it. I'll use a new application pool for this. I'll call it SSAS Tabular. The important configuration change is to make this use a classic pipeline mode. Click OK. And then the next thing I'll do is edit the application pool to use a custom account that I had created in Active Directory before. And now my application pool is in place. I can create a site to go along with it. I'll click Add Website. I'll call that SSAS Tabular. Select the folder where those files are that I copied. And connect as. Application user is what I would like in my configuration because I want the end user's credential to come right through if they connect to the web server with integrated auth. I can click the test settings button to make sure it works, and it does. And I want everyone to connect with SSL through port 443. I already have a wildcard SSL certificate installed in IIS, so I can just use that and then put in the host header that I created in DNS. And click OK to save everything. Now we just have a couple more configuration changes to make in IIS and we'll be finished. The first one is to select what kind of authentication methods we're going to allow to IIS. So if I go into my sites and choose SSAS Tabular, the one that I've created, double click authentication, I'm going to turn on Windows authentication. I'll also turn on basic authentication, which will allow internet users whose machines aren't joined to my Active Directory domain to use this. And I'm going to turn off anonymous authentication. The next change is to add a script map. So under star.dll as the request path. For the executable, we'll go into the directory where we copied the msmdpump.dll and select that. And then we'll give that a reference name of SSAS Tabular. Again, that's just a name. It doesn't really matter. And click OK. And we'll get a warning to say that do we want to allow this ISAPI extension for this site. We certainly do, so we'll just click yes. And then finally, as I said, I don't want my users to actually have to type in this DLL name in order to connect to a cube, so I'll make the pump itself a default document on this site. Now that all the IIS configuration is complete, we can go ahead and test our configuration. And to do that, I'll just bring up Excel and go through the process of adding a connection to a multidimensional cube as I normally would. The difference is that I'll use my SSL connection through IIS to connect to the cube rather than directly connecting to the database. So if I click Data from Other Sources, Analysis Services, I'll put in my address. And this is the same address that I had specified in DNS. Since I am connected with a domain joined computer, I can just go ahead and tell it to use Windows authentication and let that pass through. And then as you can see, I get, as always, just a simple connection dialog, and the rest of this process works the same as before. Click Finish, create a pivot table, and that will allow me to connect to the cube through the pump rather than using a direct connection